Welcome back, everyone, for our penultimate presentation for the day, and it's from Val Martell, supporter of our Risk and Safety Forum over the years. And Val will be looking at what nuclear risk insurers are up to in respect of sustainability and nuclear's part in net zero. Quite a lot of chat on that today. I'll pass you over. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much for that, Jazz. So, good afternoon, everybody. As he said, I'm Val Martell, and I work for Nuclear Risk Insurers, or NRI. And you heard from our chairman, Tim, this morning. And as you heard, he's extremely passionate about climate change and sustainability. So I'm going to tell you about what NRI is actually doing and its roadmap to sustainability. So before I start, I'll just tell you a little bit more about NRI and nuclear risk insurers, because people generally are quite interested in it. So I'm an engineering surveyor with NRI, and I've worked for them for 10 years. My job is to carry out surveys of nuclear facilities in the UK and overseas to characterise the insurance risk for our underwriters. But who is NRI? So NRI, Nuclear Risk Insurers, is the UK's nuclear insurance pool. We were established in 1956 to support the initial development of the UK's civil nuclear industry. And we're one of the oldest nuclear insurance pools in the world. And we've got over 350 clients in about 29 countries, and they're shown on that map. And yes, in fact, there is a small research reactor in Peru, if anybody's wondering what that risk is. Ian talked a bit about nuclear liability law earlier in the context of fusion. But it's probably worth going over it again, that just to explain to you that insurance for nuclear events is typically arranged through international nuclear insurance pools like NRI. And this is due to the potential for the very high value losses that require insurance capacity that's beyond that of an individual insurance company. I mean, Ian talked about the catastrophic losses that are associated with nuclear installations. So NRI acts as the pool for the capacity that's offered by our member companies. So we're the UK's nuclear insurance pool, and there's about between 20 and 30 other insurance pools around the world. So there's a Swiss pool, a German pool, Chinese pool, Japanese pool, all around the world. So we insure risks, and then we also trade our risks internationally with the other pools through reciprocal arrangements. And in that way, insurance risk is spread internationally. So again, as Ian mentioned before, because of the possibility that a severe nuclear accident in one country could affect other countries, there are these conventions in place relating to nuclear insurance, and he talked about the Paris Convention, but there's others, the Vienna Convention and others as well. And they set out the limits on liability that a nuclear operator must have insurance against. And Ian also talked about the conventions providing for the strict channeling of liability to the operator of a nuclear facility to make sure that someone can be held accountable for accidents, and a member of the public can easily seek damages regardless of where they live and where an accident's taken place. So that's just a bit of background on NRI and nuclear insurance, and I'm quite happy to answer any questions on that as well if anybody wants to know any more about it. But the purpose of this talk was to talk about NRI's sustainability ambitions. So, as I say, NRI is led by Tim Stone, who gave you the keynote address this morning. And we also have Managing Director Mark Popplewell, who is equally as passionate about climate change and sustainability and what we should be doing with it. So, through their leadership, NRI has set itself an ultimate ambition to support the decarbonisation of the full nuclear supply chain. And we regard ourselves as part of that nuclear supply chain. And it is really the case that promoting a broader sustainability agenda has become integral to all of our activities over the last few years in NRI. But there's really three strands to it. So the first is that we wanted to become carbon neutral for our own activities in running the business. The second was that we wanted to challenge and encourage others regarding sustainability. And this ties in quite nicely with Estelle's presentation about ESG investment and so on. And third, and probably the most significant of these, is that as insurers, we provide social licence to nuclear operators to allow them to generate carbon-free power. And we provide them with social licence by making sure that they can get insurance. So the first thing, carbon neutrality. How do we get there? How do we make ourselves carbon neutral? It's a bit of a long story, actually, this, because we've been talking about it for quite a few years. But it was around about 2017, we were sponsoring an MPhil student at Cambridge, a guy called Bertie Ivory Peters. And when he completed his studies in 2019, Bertie actually co-founded a company with another colleague that was an analytics company aiming to improve sustainability of SMEs and small businesses and help them to reduce their carbon footprint. So it was quite serendipitous, really. So it was around this time, 2019, our MD, Mark, he was really wanting NRI to up their game in terms of sustainability. And he said he wanted NRI to become net zero in 2020. But he was quite clear that he didn't want us to just be greenwashing the company and just pay to offset our emissions. He actually wanted us to do something. So as a minimum, we needed to look at how we could measure our emissions. And then we needed to understand how we could reduce them. And ideally, our reduction would be in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. So we set a target to reduce by 50% from our base year, which it turns out was 2018, by 2030. So it was approximately a 6% year-on-year reduction in our carbon emissions is what we were looking for. And then we would offset any avoidable or unavoidable carbon emissions. So in June 2019, we started a project with the help of Bertie and Electro to look at NRI's carbon footprint. And I mean, the main point really was to establish what our baseline was. So what did we do? This is our timeline. So in 2019, we asked Electro to help us measure our carbon footprint for 2018. And they developed their methodologies for our business. And so they were easily able to do this again for the years 2019 and 2020. So following their initial work in 2019, we were able to become carbon neutral by offsetting our carbon emissions for the previous year. And at this time, we also became a signatory to the UN's Climate Neutral Now initiative, which we were very pleased about. And we pledged to measure our emissions, to reduce our emissions, and to contribute to offset the unavoidable emissions. During 2020, again with Electro's help, we developed a sustainability policy for NRI. And part of this was to identify key carbon performance indicators that would help us to reach our 50% reduction target. And this, again, tying in with Estelle's presentation, this is very much part of our ESG metrics now. So the policy was formally implemented at the start of 2021, and we also included personal objectives relating to sustainability in everybody's performance reviews, so that was quite a step change. In summer of this year, we submitted our annual report to the Climate Neutral Now initiative, and we got 3 goals for our efforts to measure, reduce and contribute to climate neutrality. So it all sounds good. However, when we analysed our carbon footprint, this highlighted the issues that, to be honest, we already knew about really in terms of the contributors to our carbon emissions. And of course, 2020 and 2021 haven't really been normal working years for any of us. But if we just have a look at our carbon footprint, now, NRI is quite a small company with about 15 employees, and we're based in central London, although a couple of people work from home. I work from home. You can see from this what our total company emissions were in tonnes of CO2. So in 2018, it was 227. In 2019, it was 312. And then, of course, in 2020, it dropped down to 57. It's interesting, though, when you look at these numbers for the company as a whole, because we did look at benchmarks of CO2 per employee, but the benchmarks per employee tend to be based on the contribution to GDP of the industry that you're working in. And as we're part of the finance industry, which has got is a high contributor to GDP, we were well within the benchmark on a per employee basis. So that didn't really help us much. So as I said, we're looking at the total for the company. So you can see from that we get quite a big change from 2018 to 2019, and that's just because of the nature of our business. And you can see how much it dropped off in 2020. This slide has just got a bit more of a breakdown across the categories. And it wasn't a surprise to us at all that by far the biggest contributor in any year is travel. More than 90% of our carbon footprint comes from travel. Very broadly, the split has been 80% for international business travel, 10% for commuting, and 10% on other overheads like running the office and stuff like that. And even last year, when we were only really operating normally for the first 3 months of the year, travel was still the largest contributor. As part of the assessment, we did look at our office accommodation arrangements. And to be honest, our landlords were already pretty good. So they were already buying our electricity from zero carbon sources and monitoring energy use. And we found that the building managers were already a signatory to the World Green Building Council's net zero commitment, which we didn't know about until we asked them. So clearly, if we wanted to significantly reduce our carbon footprint, we needed to significantly reduce our international travel, or at least make it less carbon intensive. But the problem we have is that international travel is a necessary part of conducting our business. We insure nuclear facilities around the world. That's my job, is to carry out insurance surveys at these facilities. Similarly, because we reinsure all our risks reciprocally with the other international insurance pools, the underwriters are quite often travelling internationally to carry out various negotiations. But, as I say, 2020 and 2021 have been different years for all of us, and we did learn that some of our activities could be carried out effectively using remote technology. So our challenge going forward, like everybody, we need to think about what our new normal working arrangements will look like. We need to think about how we can reduce the impact of our travel, which is a necessary part of running our business. We need to think about whether we should reset our targets and our key carbon performance indicators. And also we want to think about how we can gauge everybody who works for NRI. Because one of the problems we have is that of the people who work for NRI, only about half of them actually do travel. And so it's how do we engage the people who aren't travelling to think that they can make a difference. So just talking about the new working practices. I mean, everybody last year had to adopt new working practices, and NRI was no different. And we found that some things worked well and some things didn't work too well. In NRI, working from home will continue to some extent, but they are trying to get people to come into the office maybe 2 or 3 days a week. But we did find that the sort of intra-office communications remain quite good. And we did actually have a couple of new starters during the pandemic who seemed to settle in quite well. But I think it was clear that there is still a place for these face-to-face meetings, and the associated hospitality is quite important in a business like ours as well. But one of the changes we'll make is we did used to hold some sort of longer meetings, so where people came in person from all around the world. And what we're going to do now with those meetings is they'll probably be held more frequently with a more focused agenda and shorter. Because when you're doing a video conference, you've got to then, if everybody's not in one place, you've got to accommodate the time differences. So we've got people coming from America and people coming from China. There's only a short window within the day when we can actually carry out video conferences like that. As part of my job, I did do a few remote insurance surveys. And at the time, I thought they were kind of okay. They were kind of I thought they were reasonably okay. Probably not as insightful as actually visiting a site. But in fact, 2 weeks ago, I actually resumed international travel and did a proper survey, and I realised actually, there isn't much comparison between a full site survey and a remote survey. Because over the years, we've found that, they tell us, now show us approach is what we need. They'll tell us what they're doing, but then they need to show us on the site as well. So we're certainly not proposing to continue with remote surveys once all the restrictions on travel and site access have been lifted. So our business travel to surveys in particular is likely to continue. So what we're going to have to do really is, for meetings and so on, we'll say, first of all, is the travel absolutely essential? And then we'll try and reduce the how carbon intensive it is. So if we're only going to Europe, we might go on the train instead. We'll try and get flights that are direct rather than connecting flights. But the most contentious suggestion of all, of course, is that we downgrade from business class to economy for shorter flights. And ideally, what we'd like to see is the day was when we're meeting with our international pools colleagues, when it's preferred that you boast that you've used a less carbon intensive means of travel, rather than that your company has allowed you to take a business class flight. So it is going to be a challenge and a change for us. But then no one said it was going to be easy. So I was just going to run through now just to let you know what our carbon offsets were, just in case you were interested. I mean, there's been a lot in the press about carbon offsets and whether they actually do more harm than good or not. So for our offsets, we did take advice and we looked at Gold Standard, who claim to have verified the impact from their projects. And also the United Nations have some certified emission reduction units. And then within the company, we looked at various sustainability goals. and to decide which were the ones that we wanted to support mostly, and they were around fresh water and zero hunger and climate change. So the 3 projects that we supported for 2020 related to a biomass fuel plant in India, where they use renewable rice husks to replace fossil fuel intensive power. There's a solar cooking scheme for refugee families in Chad, which I thought was also good, because one of the side benefits from this is it means that women and girls are not at risk having to travel out looking for firewood. And there's also a hydro scheme in Chile, which aims to develop relationships with rural communities and includes reforestation. So those are the schemes that we supported to offset our 2020 emissions. And in fact, for 2020, as you'll have seen, our emissions were much reduced because of the pandemic restrictions, but we did actually offset 300 tonnes, which was what we estimated it would have been had we not had the pandemic restrictions in place. So, the second strand of NRI sustainability ambitions relates to challenging and encouraging other people, because this is something that everybody in NRI can do. And we do think that one of the largest impacts NRI can have is to encourage both ourselves as individuals and in the workplace and other companies to take similar action. So NRI does aim to lead by example. It will challenge and encourage its partners, clients and suppliers to help them to adopt their own sustainability initiatives. So at board level, both Mark and Tim are very active in trying to influence our members, who are insurance companies, to follow our lead in becoming net zero. And this has been helped recently by Lloyd's of London, who have launched a climate action roadmap only this year of activities supporting decarbonisation pathways in the priority sectors of the insurance market, including nuclear. So we're working with Lloyd's to provide a case study of our sustainability programme and the challenges as we see them. And again, this ties in with what Estelle was talking about the desirability of ESG-friendly investments. And clearly this is becoming more and more important in the insurance markets as well. So, as I said, we wanted to challenge ourselves and others. We wanted to help to disrupt for good and find other ways to do things that are more sustainable. And I mentioned the difficulty we have in our organisation, that only half of the people there actually contribute to the carbon emissions through travel. So what we've done is we set up what we call an innovative actions database, where we encourage everyone to log their ideas and their actions. So big or small, all actions are important. There's no right answers, and there's certainly not any wrong answers. And through these innovative actions in this database, we hope that everyone in NRI can be involved and contribute to our ambitions. So I'll give you a few examples. I mean, Jazz told us this morning that he just bought himself an electric car. Well, you might like to suggest to Jazz that we've got a salary sacrifice scheme to make it a much cheaper way of leasing an electric car. So there's a few of us have now been able to take advantage of that scheme. Although I have to say, I'm not sure whether that is the most sustainable solution, or whether I should just be driving my aged Vauxhall Mariva into the ground rather than buying a new electric car. Another thing that we've done, somebody suggested, a couple of our staff members are actually vegan and have long been trying to persuade us all to reduce our meat consumption. So we had a vegetarian week in May, and it was proposed that we all tried out vegetarian recipes. We had a Teams channel and we all posted our pictures from home, and we gave a prize for the meat-free meal that our vegan colleagues would most like to eat. So that was just a bit of fun, but it did sort of get people used to the idea of reducing our meat consumption. And I say we've had other suggestions about office recycling now that we've resumed some office working. We've even had sort of some crazy suggestions. So one of our staff is a tennis coach, and she now brings in her used tennis balls so that we can recycle them as toys for our dogs. So we've got lots of ideas, lots of suggestions, and as we always say, big or small, it doesn't matter. There's no right answers. Nobody's got the right answer to this solution. So there's no right answers, no wrong answers. Right, so the final part of NRI's sustainability ambitions, as I said, is in terms of supporting nuclear technologies and new nuclear technologies. Because I think, we all agree that nuclear energy must form the baseload of a future low-carbon energy generation. So NRI's purpose and its core function is providing nuclear insurance. And this ensures that the statutory liability limits set by the international conventions that Ian mentions can be met. But these new and innovative nuclear technologies might well require a different type and level of insurance. Ian talked about this, about the different regulatory regimes and so on, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But before I talk about this, the one question that everybody always asks is, how on earth do you go about pricing a nuclear insurance risk in the first place? So I'll just say a bit about this. So pricing a nuclear insurance risk, well, I'm an engineer, and pricing a nuclear insurance risk is actually the art of the insurance underwriter. So there's a number of factors involved in pricing a risk, and I've sort of shown them on this diagram. So we have market conditions and knowledge. So if, for example, if you price it too high, you could lose market share. If you price it too low, and you might not be reflecting the actual risk of the business that you're insuring. You need to make sure you get a financial return for our pool members. You know, they're looking to make a financial return for providing access to their capacity. So they want to cover their costs and they want to make a profit. So profit targets do have to be taken into account as well in the pricing. And then the third bit is the bit I do, is the technical assessment of the risk. Now, some parts of the risk characterisation are largely fixed, regardless of what type of nuclear facility it is. So it's like, where is it? What's the local population? What are the neighbours? What are the natural hazards in the area? And following Johnny's presentation this morning, yes, we do consider the potential impact of climate change on the natural hazards exposure at any site. You know, we look at the political stability in the place where the location that the site is located. And a key part of our characterisation of the risk, following on from the presentation on human performance, is about behaviours and culture. And again, that can be independent of the reactor type too. But it's clear that the nuclear risk characteristics of some of the new reactor designs are very different to the existing reactor technologies, and they will require a different type and level of insurance. And we're working with the developers of these new designs to look at ways to adapt and innovate our insurance products. For some designs, it's going to lead to a fundamentally different approach to our insurance risk characterisation. But like Ian said, you know, the insurance industry isn't alone in this challenge. We need new models of appropriate and proportionate legislation and regulation. They'll all need to be developed. So I've just highlighted a few examples of the new technologies that we've been looking at. The first one is the high temperature gas cooled reactors at Shidao Bay in China. So there's two small reactors there, 250 megawatt thermal each, helium cooled. Each has got one steam generator driving a single. There's one turbine, two reactors. So they use this spherical fuel. They started to load it in August this year, and I think first criticality was last month, and it's expected to connect to the grid before the end of the year. So this design, I'm sure you all know, has got inherent safety features, particularly related to the fuel, and that should prevent progression of any event to a severe accident. But that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be other scenarios with a smaller off-site release arising from, for example, a fuel handling plant or the helium purification plant. But the scale of the risk compared to Generation 3 designs is fundamentally different. In terms of regulation, the Chinese regulator is still requiring, for example, the same emergency planning arrangements as the existing designs, but this might change. But typically when we're insuring a new build, we provide nuclear insurance from the moment that nuclear fuel arrives on site. So this plant has been insured through the insurance pools. And our characterisation of the risk for underwriting this plant has already had to change. So the China Nuclear Insurance Pool have developed a methodology for a technical price for the insurance, but we have also needed to be able to characterise the risk ourselves to determine if we would want to participate in any reinsurance. The next new technology we're considering actively are the SMRs. Now, CRA have done a lot of work on this, thinking about the potential impact of SMRs on the environment, and there are lots of things that we need to consider. So there's the passive systems that cool the reactor indefinitely, which should lead to a reduction in both accident frequency and severity. I've talked to CRA previously about whether the dose contour for a 5 millisievert event might actually be within the licence site boundary. Again, that'll change the insurance requirements. Whether the source term, which scales linearly with reactor power, does that impact on the environment, and is that the same? Because after all, it's the impact on the environment is what we're insuring. If the calculated core damage frequency is several orders of magnitude less than a Generation 3 design, Should that be directly reflected in the insurance pricing model? Probably not. So again, we really do have to review our characterisation of the insurance risk for these new designs, and that'll largely be led by the safety analysis that's carried out by the likes of CRA in licensing these designs. And the final example we've got is fusion. So as we know, it's always been 30 years in the future. And I'm kind of starting to think it might actually happen in my remaining lifetime. And I was delighted that Ian thinks it'll be 2040. But they do say that fusion will be ready when society needs it. And perhaps we are getting to that point. And as Ian said, last week the government published its green paper setting out their proposals for a regulatory framework for fusion energy. And that paper does also discuss insurance aspects. It is a good paper, actually, if you want to. It's quite readable, and it is a good paper. So NRI doesn't necessarily advocate that fusion should be regarded as a nuclear risk under the liability conventions in the same way as the existing nuclear fission technologies. But there are advantages in the convention approach, and Ian also talked about these. In particular, it sets a limit on the liability, so that gives certainty in terms of financing these new plants, and also the strict channeling of liability to the operator. These aspects are all covered in the green paper, and it seems to agree. And it says that liability should be capped, with the liability cap set at an appropriate level for the hazard on the site, and yes, we would agree with that. And that the same approach of channeling liability should be replicated in any fusion liability regime. So encouragingly, in the paper, it does actually say the government hopes to initiate the development of commercial insurance provision that is appropriate for fusion. And that's very much what NRI will be hoping to contribute to. So we are looking forward to being able to innovate our insurance products and support all these new technologies. I think Ian did make a very good point when he was talking about regulation and ONR and saying that it shouldn't stifle development. Certainly we wouldn't want to. We just want to support and help all these new technologies come to market however we can. So, to conclude, I mean, you heard Tim this morning. Promoting a broader sustainability agenda really is integral to NRI's activities and our management and leadership. We do aim to lead by example by following good sustainability practice. We want to reduce the direct environmental impacts of all of our activities, and we want to help our clients and our partners to do the same. But our core function is to provide nuclear insurance. So we will innovate and hopefully produce insurance products for the new nuclear technologies and support their social license to operate. That's it. So I'm happy to take any questions.
That's fantastic, Val. You've covered a lot of ground there, lots of different topics and areas. If I may just pick on a couple of ones around the sustainability carbon footprint piece. Clearly, the pandemic has shown that you can do remote inspections and so on and so forth, but at the same time you said when you did one remotely, but then you found that when you went and did it physically, you were let's put it another, certain things were coming to light which you necessarily wouldn't have done if it was a remote inspection.
Yeah, I think it is clear that you do need to actually physically be on site. It's like the tell us, show us aspect of it. So if you do a remote survey, you want to get the tell us side of it, and until you can actually go onto the site and observe behaviours and state of equipment, material condition and so on, you don't really get the full picture.
That's interesting, because I know the IEA are spending a lot of efforts on remote inspection.
Yeah.
You know, to cut cost. Cost is a big driver, but obviously that then has a impact on your carbon footprint as well. Is that something that is being looked at within the insurance pool to start thinking about? Well, it is a good equation.
In some respects it is, but what I would say is that what we do is a survey, so it's not an inspection and it's not an audit. And I agree that if you were just wanting to witness an activity being carried out, then yes, you can do that perfectly well with somebody having a camera there. But that's not what we do. I say we do a survey, so we take a sample. It's not an inspection, it's not an audit, it's a survey. And a key part of that really is conducting the site tours so that we can actually see. As I say, it's about the human factors and the behaviours. That's what we want to see. Yeah.
That makes sense. And then finally, in terms of what you guys are up to, it's fantastic. And do you have a platform from which you could share your knowledge, the journey you've been on in terms of NRI, trying to reduce your carbon footprint, which are the rest of your insurance community can learn from and try to drive their measure and drive their carbon footprint down?
We don't have a formal platform at the moment. We do occasionally put things on our website and so on, and on LinkedIn. But no, we don't have a formal platform. And I'll mention that to Mark and suggest it.
I think you should do, yes, because the insurance industry is steeped in tradition and dated back in time as well. But maybe it should be something that you could be championing the cause of.
Yes, we should.
Thank you very much. And in the interest of time, there are some other questions, but I think we'd best move on as we get to the end of it, onto our next presentation.
Right.
Thank you very much, Val. Much appreciated.